The sea has a way of stealing your sense of what is real. If you have ever stood on the deck of a massive cruise liner in the middle of the night, you know that low, constant thrum. It is the vibration of the engines deep in the gut of the ship, a rhythmic pulse that feels more like a heartbeat than a machine. On the morning of March 24, 1998, that heartbeat was the only thing keeping the silence at bay as the Rhapsody of the seas cut through the dark Caribbean waters toward the coast of Curaçao. Inside Suite 866, the Bradley family was deep in that heavy, satisfied sleep that only comes after days of tropical sun and nights of celebration. For Ron Bradley, the peace was about to shatter in a way no father ever prepares for. At exactly 5:30 in the morning, Ron stirred. It was not a nightmare or a sudden noise that woke him, just the natural internal clock of a man on vacation. He sat up in the dim light, the cabin air thick and salty. He walked over to the sliding glass door that led out to their private balcony. Through the glass, in the soft grey light of the pre-dawn, he saw a sight that should have been comforting. There, reclined on one of the lounge chairs, were his daughter's legs. He could see them clearly from the hips down, resting casually as she slept. Amy had mentioned she was not feeling great earlier, blamed it on the motion of the boat, and said she wanted some fresh air to settle her stomach. Seeing her there, seemingly asleep in the breeze, Ron felt a quiet satisfaction. He did not want to disturb her. He did not want to break the silence. He turned back to his bed, pulled up the covers, and let himself drift off for just a few more minutes. It was a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. While Ron dozed, the ship was a ghost town. At 5:45 in the morning, most of the 2,000 passengers were still dreaming of the island they were about to visit. The casinos were dark, the buffet lines were empty, and the only people moving were the early shift crew members prepping for the docking in Curaçao. In that 30-minute window, something shifted. The air changed. The heartbeat of the ship kept thrumming, but the girl on the balcony was no longer part of its rhythm. At exactly 6 o'clock, Ron's eyes snapped open again. The sun was starting to bleed across the horizon now, turning the sky a bruised purple and orange. He stood up, expecting to see Amy coming inside to get ready for the day. He stepped toward the balcony door. This time, the lounge chair was empty. The space where her legs had been just a half hour before was now just a vacant piece of plastic and fabric. Ron stepped out into the wind, his eyes scanning the small deck. He saw her cigarettes. He saw her lighter. They were gone from the table, as if she had tucked them into a pocket before stepping away. But then his eyes dropped to the floor, and he felt a jolt of pure dread. Her sandals. They were sitting there, side by side. These were not just any shoes. They were her favorite pair, the one she wore everywhere. In the confusion of that moment, a cold realization started to crawl up Ron's spine. Amy was a seasoned athlete, a trained lifeguard, who respected the power of the water. She was also a woman who was terrified of heights and petrified of the open ocean. Why would she leave the safety of the balcony? Why would she leave her shoes behind? And where could a 23-year-old woman possibly go on a locked ship in the middle of the sea? He did not know it yet. But the nightmare had already begun. The vanishing point had been reached. Within the next hour, the family would be screaming for help, and the ship's crew would be looking at their watches, more worried about their docking schedule than a missing girl in a yellow shirt. Before we dive into the heart of this mystery, join our community at Cold Case Files by hitting that subscribe button and turning on notifications. We explore the cases the world tried to forget. Where are you watching from today? What time is it there, and what is the weather like today? Let us know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Ron began to search. He walked the long, white corridors of Deck 8. He checked the elevators. He looked for a girl with short brown hair and those unmistakable green eyes. He saw the early morning crew members, but none of them had seen her. By 6:30, the confusion turned into a harrowing panic. He rushed back to the room and woke his wife, Eva, and his son, Brad. "Amy is gone," he said. The family rushed to the ship's security, begging for an announcement, pleading with them to keep the gangplank up so no one could leave the ship once they docked. But they were met with a wall of corporate indifference. The crew told them it was too early to wake the other 2,000 passengers. They were more worried about the breakfast schedule than a missing person. While the Bradleys were living through a nightmare, the ship was preparing to lower its doors and let a flood of people out into the streets of Curaçao, potentially taking Amy with them. The announcements did not start until 7:50 in the morning, long after the first passengers had already stepped onto land. The voice over the intercom was calm, almost bored, asking for Amy Bradley to come to the purser's desk. But by then, the ship was no longer a safe haven. It was a crime scene that had already been opened to the world. To understand the magnitude of what vanished into the salt air that morning, you have to look past the missing person posters and the graininess of the ship's surveillance footage. You have to look at the girl who was standing in the sun just weeks before everything went dark. Amy Lynn Bradley was not a statistic or a character in a tragedy. She was a daughter, a best friend, and a woman who had fought hard to build a life she loved in the heart of Virginia. Amy was born on May 12, 1974, in Petersburg, Virginia. She grew up in a household where discipline and connection were the foundations of daily life. Her parents, Ron and Ivor, raised her alongside her younger brother, Brad, in a community where family bonds were everything. Amy and Brad were more than just siblings. They were a team. Brad would later speak about her as the life of the party, someone whose energy was infectious and whose presence could change the temperature of a room. Amy's true arena was the basketball court. She was a powerhouse from a young age, a lean and fast athlete who possessed a drive that set her apart from everyone else. That talent took her to Longwood University on a full athletic scholarship, the first time in the school's history that a student had attended on such a grant for basketball. She did not just play, she dominated the court, eventually graduating in December 1996 with a degree in sports psychology. By the time she stepped onto the Rhapsody of the seas at 23 years old, Amy was a force of nature. She was a trained lifeguard and a master swimmer who knew the water better than most people know their own backyards. This detail is one of the most painful for her family to remember. They struggle to reconcile the image of a woman who spent years saving others from drowning with the idea that she could simply vanish into the sea without a trace or a fight. Amy's identity was etched into her skin in the form of 4 very specific tattoos, markers of a woman who wanted the world to know exactly who she was. On her shoulder, she wore a Tasmanian devil spinning a basketball, a tribute to the game that had defined her youth. On her lower back was a sun, and on her right ankle, a Chinese symbol. Perhaps the most personal was the gecko lizard near her navel, resting right beside her navel ring. These were not random choices. They were pieces of her soul made visible. In the months leading up to that 1998 vacation, Amy's life was coming together with beautiful precision. She had just landed her first full-time job at a computer consulting firm, a role she was incredibly excited to begin. She had recently moved into her own apartment, a space of her own located nearby her parents in Chesterfield County. Most importantly, she had just adopted a bulldog named Daisy. Her mother, Eva, remembers how happy Amy was during those weeks, constantly talking about her plans and the future she was building. There was also a complexity to Amy that later portrayals often tried to simplify. While in college, she had come out as gay to her family. Brad has spent years clearing the air about this, making it clear that there was no dramatic family conflict. While there was some initial surprise, Ron and Ivor loved her unconditionally. Her girlfriends were welcomed into the home, stayed for holidays, and were treated as family members. At the time of the cruise, she was actually dating a guy, showing that her life was a tapestry of relationships that were much more fluid than a simple script could ever capture. The cruise itself was supposed to be a victory lap. Ron Bradley had won the trip as a reward from his insurance firm, and he saw it as a perfect chance for the 4 of them to reconnect before Amy dove into her new career. Amy did not want to go. Despite being a lifeguard, she had a deep, almost primal fear of the open ocean. She hated heights, and the sheer scale of the ship gave her the creeps. Her mother had to persuade her to join them, and her father and brother promised they would never leave her side. She only relented because she wanted to spend that time with Brad, who had just come home from college. She packed 10 pairs of shoes for that week, 9 of which would be found abandoned in her cabin after she vanished. She spent her time on the ship writing postcards to her friends and buying gifts to bring back to Virginia. There was no hint of a woman looking for an exit. There was no sign of someone planning a final act. She was a woman with a new dog, a new job, and a life waiting for her on land. When you look at the photos of Amy on that ship, you see a woman who was trying to push past her fears for the sake of her family. She was standing on the edge of the world she knew, looking toward a future that was bright and certain. It is that certainty that makes her disappearance so haunting. Amy Bradley was a woman of habit and intense loyalty. If she left that cabin in the early morning hours, It was not because she was wandering aimlessly. It was because someone gave her a reason to walk out of that door, past a sandal she loved, and into the wind. To truly understand the mystery of what happened to Amy Lynn Bradley, we have to look closer at the night before everything changed. Imagine the Rhapsody of the Seas as a massive floating city, cut off from the rest of the world by miles of black, churning ocean. On the night of March 23, 1998, the mood on board was electric. The formal dinners were over, the ties were loosened, and the families were scattering across the decks to find their own version of a perfect vacation night. Amy and her brother Brad were no different. After spending the evening with their parents, the siblings decided to head up to the ship's nightclub, the Blue Orchid Lounge, located high up on deck 9. They were young, they were on vacation, and they were finally starting to relax. Amy, who had been so nervous about the height of the ship and the vastness of the water, seemed to have finally found her rhythm. As the music started to thump through the speakers, a new player entered the story. His name was Alistair Douglas, though everyone on the ship knew him simply as Yellow. He was the bass player for the ship's house band, Blue Orchid. With his shock of bright yellow-dyed hair, he was impossible to miss, a vibrant, charismatic presence who moved through the crowd with the ease of someone who owned the room. Witnesses later described Yellow as having taken a keen interest in Amy that night. He was not just a musician on a stage, he was in the crowd, he was talking, and eventually he was dancing with Amy. We do not have to guess what that looked like, because the ship's videographer, a man named Chris Fenwick, caught them on tape. In that footage you see Amy. She is moving to the music, smiling, looking like any other 23-year-old girl on a dream vacation. She looks safe. She looks happy. It is a haunting piece of film, because for the world, this is the last time Amy Bradley looks like herself, unburdened and free. Yellow is there too, leaning in, part of her space. It is an interaction that Yellow would later try to downplay, telling anyone who would listen that he barely knew her. But the camera does not lie, and neither do the passengers who watched them together for hours. As the clock ticked past midnight and into the early hours of March 24th, the party began to wind down. Brad Bradley decided he had had enough and headed back to Suite 8066. The ship's computerized lock system, the digital heartbeat of the vessel, recorded his room key swiping at exactly 3:35 in the morning. Just 5 minutes later, at 3:40, Amy's key card swiped. She was right behind him. The siblings did not go straight to bed. Instead, they stepped out onto the balcony to talk and smoke cigarettes. This is where the story gets heavy. Amy told Brad she was not feeling great. She blamed the motion of the boat since they had left Aruba earlier that evening. Brad, being the protective younger brother, sat with her for a while. They talked about their plans for the next day in Curaçao. They laughed. And then, at 4 o'clock in the morning, Brad stood up to go to sleep. The last thing he ever said to his sister was, "I love you." She told him she wanted to sit in the fresh air and the wind for a while longer to settle her stomach. She was sitting in a lounge chair, her cigarettes and lighter nearby. Brad went to bed, and the cabin went quiet. Now, this is where the timeline starts to fracture. This is where the story turns into a labyrinth of contradictions. Yellow Douglas told the FBI and later told news outlets like CNN that his interaction with Amy ended much earlier. He claimed he went to bed at 1 o'clock in the morning because he had to be out of the passenger areas by then. He insisted that was the last time he ever saw her. But if that is true, how do you explain the witnesses? At 5:30 in the morning, the exact same time Ron Bradley was looking at his daughter's legs on the balcony, other passengers were seeing a very different scene. Two 18-year-old passengers, Laurie Thompson and Crystal Roberts, were out on the deck. They were not ready for the night to end, so they were wandering the ship. They reported seeing Amy Bradley and Yellow Douglas together in a glass elevator, riding up toward the top deck. They described a specific, unsettling detail. They said Yellow was handing Amy a drink. It was a dark, brown liquid. What was in that glass? Was it a simple soda for a girl with an upset stomach? Or was it something designed to bypass the defenses of a trained athlete and master swimmer? The witnesses said that just 15 minutes after they saw the pair together, they saw Yellow again. This time, he was walking alone. He was moving briskly, looking like a man with somewhere to be. Amy was nowhere to be found. This sighting happened between 5:30 and 6 o'clock in the morning, the precise window of time when Amy vanished from that balcony. The contradictions do not stop there. After Amy went missing, other stories about Yellow started to surface. The Bradley family eventually found a post on a cruise ship computer bulletin board from a previous passenger. The post was a warning. It told female passengers to stay away from the bass player with the yellow hair. It described him as someone who was overly aggressive and made women feel unsafe. When the FBI finally grilled Yellow, they put him through a polygraph test. He passed, or rather, the results were inconclusive, depending on which report you read. He walked out of that interview smiling, allegedly giving a thumbs up to his band members as if the whole thing was a joke. But for the Bradleys, there was nothing funny about it. They had a daughter who was terrified of the ocean, a girl who would not go near the railing unless someone held her hand, yet witnesses saw her heading toward the highest point of the ship, with a man who was not supposed to be there. How does a girl go from a safe balcony to a glass elevator in 15 minutes? And more importantly, who was waiting for her when the elevator doors finally opened? These questions are not just for the investigators. They are for the 2,000 passengers who were on that boat. They are for the crew members who saw things they were told to forget. And they are for us because the more we look at the timeline of that night, the more we realize that Amy Bradley did not just disappear. She was erased, one shadow at a time. Imagine for a moment that you are Ron Bradley. You have just spent the last 30 minutes in a light, morning doze, the kind of sleep where the world feels soft and safe. But when you open your eyes again at 6 o'clock on March 24th, 1998, the world has gone sharp. The lounge chair where your daughter's legs were resting just a moment ago is now a vacant plastic frame. Ron did not scream yet. He did not run for the alarm. His first move was the logical one, the one any of us would make. He thought maybe she had finally conquered that fear of hers and stepped out to grab a cup of coffee or take a few photos of the Curaçao coastline as the ship slowed down for port. He walked through the suite, checking the small bathroom, calling her name in a heavy whisper so as not to wake Ivor or Brad. Silence was his only answer. He stepped out into the hallway. The Rhapsody of the Seas is a labyrinth of steel, glass, and endless white corridors. Ron began to walk, his pace quickening with every empty corner he turned. He went to the elevators. He checked the coffee stations. He looked for a girl in a yellow polo shirt, a girl who stood 5 feet 7 inches tall, with short brown hair and those unmistakable green eyes. He saw plenty of people, early risers and crew members in their crisp uniforms, but none of them were Amy. By 6:30, the rising bile of panic was impossible to ignore. He rushed back to suite 866 and woke his family. "Amy is not here," he said. The words felt wrong in the air, like a glitch in the reality of their vacation. Eva and Brad were on their feet in seconds. They checked the room one more time, and that was when the true weight of the situation hit them. Amy's favorite sandals were still on the floor. To anyone else, it might have been a minor detail, but to the Bradleys, those shoes were a siren. Amy was terrified of the ocean. She was afraid of the open railings. She would never, under any circumstances, walk out of that cabin and navigate the heights of a cruise ship in her bare feet. Her cigarettes were gone. Her lighter was gone. But her shoes, the very things she would need to walk more than 10 feet, were abandoned. The family sprinted to the purser's office. This is where the story shifts from a missing person case to a study in bureaucratic coldness. Ron and Eva were frantic, their voices cracking as they explained that their 23-year-old daughter was missing. They did not want a polite conversation. They wanted an alarm. They wanted the ship to stop. The response from the staff was a slap in the face. They were told it was too early to make an announcement. The crew did not want to wake the other 2,000 passengers. They did not want to disturb the morning peace of people who had paid thousands of dollars for a carefree escape. While the Bradleys were living through the worst moments of their lives, the cruise line was worried about the breakfast rush. As the sun climbed higher, the scenic coastline of Curaçao began to loom large in the windows. The ship was entering the channel, preparing to dock at the floating bridge port. For Ron and Ivor, that island was not a destination. It was a threat. They knew that once those gangplanks went down, the ship was no longer a contained environment. Anyone could walk off. Any crew member could smuggle a drugged girl through a service exit. They begged the captain. They pleaded with the senior officers. Keep the gangplank up. Lock the doors. Search the ship while everyone is still on board. The answer was a firm, unwavering no. The schedule was more important than the search. At the scheduled time, the massive steel doors of the ship hissed open. The gangplank was lowered, and a flood of people, 2,000 passengers and hundreds of crew members poured out onto the streets of Curaçao. It was a literal floodgate opening. If Amy was being held, if she had been lured away, this was the moment her captors were waiting for. She could have been moved in a laundry bin or large equipment crate, or simply walked off in a wig and sunglasses while her family was still arguing with a purser about an intercom announcement. The search that finally did happen was a hollow gesture. The crew did not begin a systematic sweep until 12:15 in the afternoon, more than 6 hours after Ron first reported her missing. And when they did search, they focused only on the public spaces. They looked under lounge chairs and behind bar counters. They did not search the crew quarters. Think about the sheer size of a ship like the Rhapsody of the Seas. There are hundreds of private cabins, laundry rooms, maintenance tunnels, and storage lockers that passengers never see. The very places where a person could be hidden were the places the searchers refused to go. Finally, at 7:50 in the morning, the intercom crackled to life. But it was not an emergency alert. It was a calm, polite voice asking, "Will Amy Bradley please come to the purser's desk?" By then, the majority of the passengers were already miles away, exploring the colorful shops and beaches of the island. The announcement was a ghost calling out to a ghost. As the hours ticked by, the Rhapsody of the Seas prepared to do something truly heartbreaking. It prepared to leave. The cruise had a schedule to keep. It had to move on to Saint Martin. The captain gave the Bradleys an agonizing choice: get back on the ship and keep searching the cabins they were not allowed into, or stay behind on an island they did not know, with no resources, no instructions, and no help. They chose to stay. Ron, Eva, and Brad stood on the pier as the massive white wall of the ship began to pull away. They watched their life and potentially their daughter's kidnappers sail off into the sunset. They were left standing there in the clothes they had put on that morning, clutching missing person flyers that they had scrambled to print. They were in a foreign land, facing a language barrier, and dealing with local authorities who seemed to think Amy had just run off for a wild night of partying. The vacuum of information was suffocating. Ron kept thinking back to that 30-minute window. He kept thinking about the legs on the lounge chair and the abandoned shoes, sitting alone on the cabin floor. Think of a cruise ship like a sovereign nation. It has its own rules, its own security, and its own secrets. When you step onto that gangplank, you are essentially leaving the protection of your home soil and entering a world where the laws of the sea are written by the very company that sold you the ticket. For the Bradley family, the Rhapsody of the Seas stopped being a luxury resort and turned into a fortress of silence within hours of the disappearance of Amy Lynn Bradley. The most frustrating part of this entire story is not just that a 23-year-old woman vanished. It is how the people in charge handled the minutes and hours immediately after Ron Bradley raised the alarm. Ron was standing at the purser's desk by 6:30 in the morning. He was frantic. He was telling anyone who would listen that his daughter was gone. Instead of an immediate, ship-wide lockdown, he was met with a wall of corporate politeness. The staff told him they did not want to wake the other guests. They did not want to cause a panic. Imagine the scene for a moment. A young woman is missing on a vessel surrounded by miles of open ocean, and the primary concern is the sleep schedule of the other 2,000 passengers. This delay was the first domino to fall. The crew refused to make a public announcement until 7:50 in the morning, which meant a massive window of opportunity was lost. By the time that request for Amy to come to the purser's desk echoed through the hallways, the ship had already docked. The doors were open. The gangplanks were down. Thousands of people were already filtering into the streets of Curaçao. If someone was holding Amy, or if she was being moved against her will, the cruise line basically gave them a free pass to leave the ship without anyone looking twice. The problems went even deeper than the timing. When the crew finally did get around to looking for Amy, they did not start a systematic, room-by-room sweep. They performed what can only be described as a public areas search. They checked the bars, they checked the lounges, they looked around the pool decks. This did not happen until 12:15 in the afternoon, nearly 6 hours after the family first reported her missing. By then, any trail was not just cold, it was frozen. The biggest red flag for the family, and for anyone who looks at this case today, is what the crew did not search. They did not go into the crew quarters. On a ship like the Rhapsody of the Seas, the staff areas are a city within a city. There are hundreds of private cabins, laundry rooms, maintenance tunnels, and storage lockers that passengers never see. These areas are strictly off-limits and require special keycard access. If you wanted to hide someone on a ship, the crew quarters would be the perfect place to do it. The cruise line would not let the Bradleys in, and they did not send their own security in to do a thorough sweep of those private spaces. It was a massive blind spot that remains one of the most haunting parts of the story. You might be asking why the police or the FBI did not just step in and take over. This is where the story enters a legal no man's land. The ship was owned by a United States company, but it was flagged in Norway. At the time Amy vanished, the vessel was in international waters, defined as at least 12 nautical miles from land. This created a jurisdictional nightmare. Who has the authority to investigate a crime on a Norwegian-flagged ship in the middle of the Caribbean? Is it the Norwegian government? Is it the Dutch authorities in Curaçao? Or is it the United States? Because the victim is an American citizen. Because of this confusion, the FBI was not able to get onto the ship immediately. By the time they finally did arrive to process Amy's room, Suite 8066, the cruise line's housekeeping staff had already been through it. They had cleaned the surfaces. They had changed the linens. They had essentially wiped away any potential evidence. Footprints on the balcony, fingerprints on the door handles, a stray hair. All of it was gone. This was not necessarily a malicious act, but it was a devastating blow to the case. In a missing person investigation, the first 48 hours are everything. In Amy's case, those 48 hours were spent arguing about paperwork and cleaning cabins. The maritime industry has a long history of being remarkably opaque when it comes to crimes on board. For years, there were no real rules about how these companies had to report disappearances or assaults. It took tragedies like Amy's to finally force a change. Her brother, Brad, has spent much of his life fighting for what he calls an Amy alert, a system that would mandate an immediate, ship-wide emergency broadcast the moment someone goes missing. He believes that if the ship had just turned on the lights and told everyone to stay in their cabins that morning, Amy might be home today. It was not until the year 2010 that the United States passed the Cruise Vessel Security and Safety Act. This law finally put some teeth into maritime safety, requiring ships that dock in American ports to report serious crimes to the FBI and to install man-overboard detection systems. Back in 1998, none of that existed. Amy was on a ship that was essentially its own island, governed by its own interests. The Bradleys felt like they were fighting a ghost. Every time they asked a question, they were met with a response saying they were doing everything they could, while the ship continued to sail on its scheduled route. The fact that the ship's computerized lock system showed Amy returning to her room at 3:40 in the morning was one of the few concrete facts they had. Without a search of the entire vessel, not just the parts where the tourists hang out, that fact was just a starting point with no finish line. The jurisdictional abyss is a terrifying concept. It means that you can be on a ship with thousands of people, yet you are technically nowhere. You are in a space where no one is truly in charge of your safety once the cabin door closes. This is the secret of the cruise industry that the Bradleys want the world to know. The Rhapsody of the Seas was a beautiful scenic escape for most people on board, but for Amy Bradley, it became a place where the rules did not apply. As the ship sailed away from Curaçao, leaving the Bradleys standing on that pier with nothing but the sandals Amy left behind, the silence of the sea felt heavier than ever. In that silence, someone knew exactly what had happened in the 30 minutes between Ron seeing her legs on that chair and the chair being empty. Stay on the boat and search cabins. They were not allowed to enter or get off on an island where they had no authority and no help. They chose the island. They watched the massive white wall of the ship pull away, taking the potential crime scene and every witness with it into the sunset. If there is one name that has become the face of the mystery surrounding Suite 866, it is Alistair Douglas. But on the Rhapsody of the Seas, nobody knew him by that name. To the passengers and the crew alike, he was simply yellow. He was the kind of person you could not miss. With his shock of bright yellow dyed hair and his position as the bass player for the ship's house band, Blue Orchid, he was a staple of the ship's nightlife. He was charismatic, talented, and had a way of making people feel like they were part of an exclusive club. For the Bradley family, the name Yellow does not bring back memories of a fun night at the disco. It represents the biggest question mark in their lives. Yellow's involvement in the story starts on the night of March 23, 1998. As the Blue Orchid lounge on the 9th floor deck filled with people, Yellow was in his element. He was seen dancing and talking with Amy throughout the night. To anyone watching, it looked like a harmless holiday flirtation. The ship's videographer even caught them on tape, swaying to the music. Amy looks relaxed, She looks like she is finally enjoying herself. But as the clock moved toward the early hours of the morning, the story Yellow told investigators began to drift away from the reality reported by everyone else. Yellow later told the FBI and news outlets that he had a very strict schedule. He claimed he left the party at exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. He told them he had to be out of the passenger areas by that time because of ship regulations. He insisted that after 1 o'clock he went straight to his room and stayed there until the next morning. It is a clean, simple story. But when you look at the witness reports, that 1 o'clock deadline starts to look less like a fact and more like a story built to hide a truth. At 5:30 in the morning, the exact time Ron Bradley saw his daughter's legs on the balcony. Two 18-year-old passengers named Laurie and Crystal were wandering the ship. They were not tired yet, and they were looking for one last bit of excitement before the ship docked. They reported seeing Amy Bradley and Yellow together in a glass elevator. They were riding the elevator up toward the top deck. The girls described a scene that felt wrong. They said Yellow was handing Amy a drink, a dark, brown liquid. They noticed Amy had a camera with her. They watched as the elevator doors closed, taking the pair up toward the Blue Orchid Lounge. About 15 minutes later, those same witnesses saw Yellow again. This time, he was walking alone. He was moving fast, his pace brisk, his expression unreadable. Amy was nowhere to be seen. If Yellow was in bed by 1 in the morning, how did two teenagers see him in a glass elevator at dawn? This contradiction is the heart of the suspicion. But what happened a few hours later is what truly made the family's blood run cold. At 7:30 in the morning, Brad Bradley was sitting on the pool deck. He was a wreck. His sister had been missing for over an hour. The ship was docking, and nobody seemed to be taking him seriously. He was staring at the water, feeling the weight of a nightmare. That was when Yellow approached him. Yellow did not just walk past. He stopped. He looked at Brad and said, "Hey man, I am sorry to hear about your sister." Brad froze. He looked up at the man with the yellow hair and felt a jolt of pure terror. At 7:30 that morning, no public announcement had been made. The ship's intercom had not called for Amy. The other 2,000 passengers were still finishing their breakfast or lining up at the gangplank. Outside of the captain, the security team, and the Bradley family, nobody was supposed to know Amy was gone. Yellow did not stop there. He asked Brad what had happened, and then strangely told Brad to wait right there while he went to get a friend to listen to the story too. He told Brad he was feeling guilty about the whole thing. Brad described the entire interaction as just odd. It was as if Yellow had a script he was trying to follow, but was getting the timing all wrong. Why would a crew member feel guilty about a passenger he supposedly had not seen since 1 o'clock in the morning? And how did he know there was a tragedy to be sorry for? When the FBI finally got involved, they put Yellow through a polygraph test. He reportedly passed, though some investigators have called the results inconclusive over the years. But it is the way he left that interview that stayed with Ron Bradley. Ron watched as Yellow walked out of the room, saw his bandmates waiting for him, and gave them a big thumbs up and a smile, as if he had just won a prize instead of being questioned about a missing girl. It was a display of arrogance that the family has never forgotten. As the years turned into decades, Yellow Douglas did not stay in the world of cruise ship entertainment. He moved on, but he did not exactly hide. Investigative journalists eventually tracked him down to a remote mountain community in the country of Grenada. Now in his 50s, the man who was once the life of the party has undergone a radical transformation. He has traded the bass guitar for a Bible. Yellow is now a reverend. He leads a small congregation of about 40 or 50 people in a humble shack of a church perched on a mountainside. But it is not a traditional ministry. He is known in the community for performing exorcisms, a dramatic and haunting turn for a man whose past is defined by a disappearance in the shadows. In recent interviews, Yellow sounded exasperated when the topic of Amy Bradley came up. He yelled into the camera, "I did not do anything wrong. What am I supposed to do?" He still sticks to the 1 o'clock story. He claims that Amy told him her father had discovered she was gay and had forced her to go on the cruise as a way to fix her, a claim the family has denied. But his own family is not so sure. Yellow's daughter, Amy Douglas, has spoken out. She did not offer an alibi for her father. Instead, she spoke about the red flags she saw in him. She said that when he came back from that specific cruise in 1998, he was different. He was distant. She even mentioned that her mother, Yellow's wife at the time, found that he had become obsessive about the case. Was Yellow just a friendly musician who got caught in a tragic timeline? Or was he the hand that led Amy toward that glass elevator and into a night she would never return from? When you look at the evidence, the premature apology, the sightings by the teenage girls, and the haunting testimony of his own daughter, it becomes harder and harder to believe in coincidences. The man with the yellow hair moved to the mountains to find faith, but the shadow of Suite 8066 followed him all the way to Grenada, and until Amy is found, that shadow is not going anywhere. For years, the public believed they had heard every witness account that mattered in this case. We have all seen the grainy footage from the Blue Orchid Lounge, and we have all heard the stories of the two girls, Laurie and Crystal, who saw Amy in the elevator. But there is another voice in this story, a voice that was strangely absent from the massive Netflix documentary that recently took the world by storm. Her name is Elizabeth, and her testimony might be the most haunting piece of the entire puzzle. Imagine you are watching a 3-part series, thinking you have reached the end of the mystery, only to discover that a critical piece of the narrative was left in the shadows. Elizabeth was a passenger on the Rhapsody of the Seas during that same week in March 1998. According to Amy's brother, Brad, the family only recently discovered a deposition she gave to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, a document that had been buried for decades. The scene Elizabeth describes takes us back to that high-tension window around 6 o'clock in the morning. While the ship was slowing down to dock in Curaçao, Elizabeth says she was in one of the lounges. In the quiet early morning air, she watched as Amy and the man with the yellow hair, Alistair Douglas, sat together. She did not just see them talking, she watched a specific deliberate action. She saw Yellow behind the bar, preparing a drink for Amy. It was that same dark brown liquid that the other witnesses had mentioned. As a viewer, you have to ask yourself, why was a member of the ship's band behind the bar at 6 in the morning, serving a passenger a drink that was not on the menu? What happened next feels like a scene from a fever dream. As Elizabeth watched the two of them, she says a young girl, maybe 18 or 19 years old, suddenly ran out from a back service area of the ship. The girl was not just walking, she was frantic. She was frantic. Elizabeth testified before a grand jury that this girl began yelling 2 words over and over again, "Senorita, kidnap. Senorita, kidnap." The scream echoed through the lounge, cutting through the low hum of the ship's engines. Elizabeth watched as Amy and Yellow then moved out of her line of sight, disappearing into the maze of the ship's interior. This testimony is explosive because it changes the entire nature of the disappearance. If Elizabeth is telling the truth, Amy was not just a girl who wandered off or felt sick. She was being handled. The phrase, "Senorita kidnap," is crude, simple, and terrifyingly direct. Some critics have argued that a non-native English speaker would not use that specific phrasing, that if they knew the word for kidnap, they would know how to form a full sentence. But in the heat of a high-stakes crime, language often breaks down into its most basic, urgent parts. What is even more frustrating for the Bradley family is the way the authorities handled this. Brad Bradley has been vocal in recent months, speaking out in late 2025 about how the agents seemingly dismissed these accounts. The agents told the family they could not corroborate the time frame. Yet Elizabeth's story perfectly matches the sightings by Laurie and Crystal. All 3 witnesses place Amy with Yellow at the exact moment her father discovered she was missing from the balcony. Brad has a theory about what that girl's scream really meant. He believes Elizabeth witnessed the moment of the handoff. In this scenario, Yellow was not the one who took Amy off the ship. Instead, he was the lure. He used the brown drink to disorient her, moved her through the passenger areas under the guise of being a friendly face, and then handed her over to someone else. Someone who took her down into the crew quarters or through a service door that led directly to the docks. The girl who was screaming might have been a low-level worker who saw something she was not supposed to see, or perhaps she was another victim, a warning from the shadows that Amy could not hear in her drugged state. Right now, as you watch this in early 2026, the Bradley family is still looking for Elizabeth. They want to find her, to sit her down, and to ask her the questions the authorities apparently never did. They want to know every detail of that girl's face, the exact tone of her voice, and the direction Amy was taken. The fact that this testimony exists in a sealed grand jury file but was omitted from the biggest documentary on the case is a testament to how many secrets are still buried in the hull of that ship. It makes you wonder, how many other people saw something that morning? How many others heard a scream or saw a handoff but were told to keep their mouths shut, to protect the ship's reputation. For Ivor Bradley, finding Elizabeth is about more than just evidence. It is about a mother's need to know that anyone, saw what was happening and tried to put a name to it. Century to kidnap might be a broken sentence, but it is the only cry for help Amy Bradley ever had in those final minutes on the Rhapsody of the Seas. As we look deeper into the shadows of this case, we have to move past the ship and onto the islands themselves. Because if the handoff happened, Amy was no longer on a boat. She was in a world where her 4 tattoos were the only thing that could identify her in a crowd of strangers. And as the years went by, people started seeing those tattoos in places that would make any parent's heart stop. If Amy Lynn Bradley had truly fallen over the side of the Rhapsody of the Seas, the ocean likely would have given her back eventually. The Caribbean currents and the proximity of the ship to the shore meant that a body, or at least some physical sign of a struggle with the waves, should have surfaced. Instead of a recovery, the islands began to offer up something much more haunting: a trail of sightings. Over the next 7 years, a path of breadcrumbs emerged across the Caribbean and as far away as California, painting a picture of a woman being moved through a world of shadows. The first crack in the theory that she had simply fallen came just 1 month after she vanished. In April 1998, a taxi driver in Curacao approached the Bradley family with a story that made their hearts stop. He claimed he had seen a young woman running through a parking lot near the docks on the very morning the ship arrived. She was frantic, he said, and she was looking for a phone. What stood out to him more than anything were her eyes, those distinctive green eyes that he recognized instantly from the reward posters. He saw her again at other locations on the island, always looking distressed, but local authorities never found the proof to back him up. 5 months later, in August 1998, another witness came forward with a report that was even more specific. A Canadian tourist named David Carmichael was on a beach at Porto Marie in Curacao. He saw a woman walking along the sand, flanked by 2 men. As she got closer, she seemed to realize Carmichael was speaking English. She spun around and walked toward him, looking as if she was about to say something. Carmichael noticed her tattoos: the Tasmanian devil, the sun, and the gecko lizard. He was only 2 feet away from her. Before she could speak, one of the men caught his eye and motioned her away toward a beach bar. Carmichael later saw her photo on a television program and felt a wave of sickness. He was 100% certain that the woman on that beach was Amy Bradley. The sightings only grew more disturbing from there. In January 1999, nearly 10 months after the disappearance, a United States Navy petty officer named William Hefner visited a hotel brothel in the Otrobanda district of Curacao. While he was sitting in the bar, a Caucasian woman approached him. She looked terrified. She told him her name was Amy Bradley and she begged him for help, saying she was not allowed to leave. Hefner, afraid of getting in trouble with the Navy for being in a brothel, did not report the encounter for 3 years. He only came forward after seeing Amy's face on a magazine cover. By the time the authorities reached the hotel, the brothel had burned down under suspicious circumstances, and any physical evidence was gone. The trail jumped islands in 2005. A woman named Judy Mara was in a department store restroom in Bridgetown, Barbados. When she heard a group of men enter the bathroom, she stayed in her store, listening as the men ambushed a woman, telling her that a deal was imminent and warning her that she better be on time. When Mara finally stepped out, she saw an emotional woman standing by the sink. She asked the woman if she was okay and what her name was. The woman looked at her and said, "My name is Amy." Mara recognized the woman as Amy Bradley once she returned home and saw the news. There was even a lead that took the case to the United States. A woman whose name was withheld out of fear reported seeing Amy at Pier 33 at Fisherman's Wharf in San Francisco. She described her as having frizzy hair and being escorted by 2 handlers. One of the men was a very large individual who resembled a known criminal named Alfred Cotton, who would later be arrested for human trafficking in 2016. The Federal Bureau of Investigation found this sighting credible enough to produce a new sketch of Amy, a full year before other digital leads would emerge. Even in recent months, as the world watches the latest documentaries in late 2025 and early 2026, new voices are emerging. A police clerk from Curacao has reportedly told private investigators that he has seen Amy recently. He claims she is alive and that he has seen her within the last couple of years. While many skeptics call these sightings the result of confirmation bias, people seeing what they want to see after hearing a famous story. The Bradley family sees them as a lifeline. To them, these witnesses are not just names on a page. They are the eyes that saw their daughter when the rest of the world was looking at the bottom of the ocean. In September 2005, 7 years after the Rhapsody of the Seas sailed away from that balcony in the dawn light, the digital world delivered a message that stopped the Bradley family in their tracks. It arrived as an anonymous email containing a link to a Caribbean-based website for adult entertainment. When the page loaded, the family found themselves looking at a woman identified only as Jazz or Jasmine. She was reclining on a bed in her underwear, looking directly into the lens of the camera. For Ivor and Ron Bradley, this wasn't just a girl who looked a bit like their daughter. It felt like looking at a ghost that had finally decided to step into the light. The facial structure, the slope of the nose, and the set of the eyes were so strikingly similar that the family immediately sent the images to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for a professional look. The authorities didn't just brush it off as a coincidence. Forensic specialists at the Bureau subjected the Jasmine photographs to an intense geometric analysis. They mapped the features of the woman in the ad against known photos of Amy. The conclusion from the forensic analysts was enough to make any parent's heart skip. They labeled the woman a strong match and a high probability for being Amy Lynn Bradley. There was a detail in those photos that added a layer of profound distress to the discovery. The woman in the images was posed in ways that appeared to deliberately hide the very parts of her body where Amy's 4 distinct tattoos, the sun on her back, the gecko on her navel, and the Tasmanian devil on her shoulder, would have been located. It looked less like a random pose and more like a calculated effort to conceal her identity while still putting her on display. Despite the match, the lead hit a digital wall. Because the website was hosted by a carrier outside the United States, operating out of Curacao and Barbados, the agents were unable to track the IP address or find the physical location where the woman was being held. The digital mystery didn't end with those photos. For years, the Bradley family has operated a website dedicated to finding Amy. They began to notice a haunting pattern in their traffic logs. Every single year, on Amy's birthday and on the anniversary of her disappearance, an IP address from Curacao or Barbados visits the site. This visitor doesn't just glance at the homepage. They stay on the site for exactly 45 minutes, dwelling on the family photos. Is it Amy, reaching out across the digital void to catch a glimpse of the brother and parents she was taken from? Or is it a captor, monitoring the family's hope to see if the investigation is getting too close? Even in late 2025, the signals haven't stopped. A new, highly suspicious hit to the family site was recently traced to a device on a boat near Barbados. Every time that screen lights up, the family is forced to live in the space between a lead and a dead end, wondering if the girl in the Jasmine photos is still out there, waiting for a rescue that is 27 years overdue. While the world watched a grieving family scour the Caribbean for their daughter, a much darker battle was brewing in the courtrooms of Florida. In 1999, Ron and Ivor Bradley decided to take their fight for accountability to the source. They filed 2 massive lawsuits against Royal Caribbean Cruises, seeking damages for negligence and wrongful death. To the public, this looked like a desperate family trying to force a billion-dollar corporation to finally tell the truth about what happened in Suite 866. But in October of 2000, the legal path to justice hit a wall that no one saw coming. Judge Stuart Simons did not just dismiss the cases, he dismantled the family's entire legal strategy with a phrase that still echoes in true crime circles: fraud on the court. Before we break down the judge's scathing ruling, take a moment to share this video. Every share brings fresh eyes to a cold case that refuses to stay buried, and you never know who might hold the missing piece of the puzzle. The court found that the Bradley family had engaged in a calculated effort to manipulate the narrative. During the discovery process, the Bradleys identified only 3 witnesses, people who claimed they saw Amy looking distressed or being held against her will. But Royal Caribbean's legal team dropped a bombshell. They discovered that the family had actually received over 100 other reports of sightings that they had never disclosed. These hidden reports were not about trafficking or kidnapping. Instead, these witnesses claimed they had seen Amy Lynn Bradley living freely and under no duress in various parts of Curacao and the surrounding islands after the ship had sailed away. Some people described seeing her moving through local shops or walking on beaches without anyone watching her. Because the Bradleys were simultaneously arguing that Amy was a victim of a forced abduction, The existence of 100 reports suggesting she might have walked away of her own volition was a direct threat to their legal standing. Judge Simons was merciless. He accused the parents of giving false answers under oath and intentionally suppressing evidence that contradicted their sex slave theory. He called their claims numerous exaggerated claims and ruled that the integrity of the court had been violated. The family tried to defend themselves. They insisted they only withheld the information for a short window of time because they feared that making the sightings public would put Amy in even more danger. They argued that they were simply following the advice of their attorneys, but the damage was irreversible. In March of 2002, an appellate court in Miami affirmed the dismissal in less than 1 week, a speed that showed exactly how little patience the legal system had for the situation. The fallout was more than just a lost case. It was a financial and reputational nightmare. Royal Caribbean's lawyers requested over $171,000 in legal fees and fines from the family and their law firm. For Ivor and Ron, the very system they hoped would find the truth had branded them as liars. This moment in the story is where the overboard versus trafficking debate becomes truly polarized. Were the Bradleys grief-stricken parents trying to protect their daughter, or were they curators of a mystery that was far simpler than they were willing to admit? Regardless of the answer, the legal storm left them more alone than ever, with a dwindling bank account and a daughter who was still a ghost in the Caribbean wind. Desperation is a scent that predators can smell from miles away. In 1999, as the Bradley family was entering their second year of an agonizing search, a man named Frank Jones stepped into their lives. He did not come as a stranger. He came as a savior. He spoke the language of absolute authority, claiming he was a former United States Navy SEAL and a Special Forces operator. He did not just offer hope, he offered a plan. He told Ron and Ivor that he had located Amy. According to Jones, she was being held in a heavily guarded, barbed wire compound in Curacao, surrounded by armed Colombians. He described tactical extraction windows and safe houses. He even sent the family sketches of buildings and GPS coordinates. To a family that had been met with nothing but closed doors and bureaucratic silence, Frank Jones felt like a miracle. The Bradleys were so convinced that they authorized the transfer of massive sums of money. They handed over $24,444 from their own personal savings. Beyond that, Jones managed to siphon off $186,000 from a fund established by a missing persons charity. In total, the family and the organization paid out over $210,000 to fund what they believed was a high-stakes rescue mission. Jones went to extreme lengths to maintain the illusion. He hired a woman and had Amy's distinct tattoos, the sun, the lizard, the Tasmanian devil, stenciled onto her body. He then sent blurry photographs of this woman to the family, claiming his team was tracking her movements on the beach. He told them to be ready. The deception reached a breaking point in Fort Lauderdale. The entire Bradley family was waiting in a hotel room, emotional and exhausted, with a private jet fueled up and sitting on a standby runway. They believed they were hours away from finally bringing Amy home. They were prepared to fly to the islands the moment Jones gave the signal that the extraction was complete. But the signal never came. Instead, the truth did. A member of the team Jones had supposedly recruited became suspicious. He realized they were being asked to surveil an empty house for no reason and decided to call the Bradleys directly. He outed Frank Jones as a fraud. The realization was devastating. It was not just about the lost money, it was the fact that they had been forced to mourn Amy all over again. In early 2002, the law finally caught up with him. Federal prosecutors in Richmond charged Jones with mail fraud. He pleaded guilty in April of that year and was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. He was also ordered to pay back the hundreds of thousands of dollars he had stolen, although much of it was already gone, spent on his own lifestyle in the Caribbean. Ron Bradley's reflection on this betrayal is one of the most heartbreaking parts of the entire story. He once said, "If there is a chance, what else do you do? If it was your child, what would you do?" So I guess we took a chance, and I guess we lost. For the Bradleys, Frank Jones was not just a con man. He was a monster who traded on a parent's worst nightmare for cold, hard cash. The search for Amy Lynn Bradley is not some dusty file tucked away in a basement. It is a living, breathing mystery that refuses to stay quiet. As we move into early 2026, the case is experiencing a massive wave of energy that we have not seen since she first vanished. Much of this comes from the release of the 3-part documentary, Amy Bradley is Missing, which hit screens in July 2025. The show reached millions of people across the globe, and the response was immediate. Hundreds of new tips poured in, and while many led to nowhere, a source close to the investigation has flagged 3 specific breakthroughs as very significant. The first lead is almost too heavy to imagine. Investigators are currently looking into evidence suggesting Amy might have had a child during her decades in the Caribbean. This has opened a brand new path for DNA testing and family searches throughout the region. Then there is the digital trail. A highly suspicious hit to the family's memorial website was recently traced back to a device on a boat near Barbados. This matches a pattern the Bradleys have tracked for years, an IP address from the islands visiting the site on birthdays and holidays, staying for exactly 45 minutes to look through family photos. The case has even gained support from the highest levels of pop culture. In late 2025, Kim Kardashian shared Amy's story with her millions of followers, calling the situation mind-blowing. This spotlight has added massive momentum to a petition for a mandatory Amy alert system. This system would force cruise lines to make immediate, ship-wide announcements and mobilize every passenger the moment a person is reported missing. It is a safety measure that could have changed everything on that morning in 1998. Over in Curaçao, a police clerk has reportedly told private investigators that he has seen Amy alive within the last couple of years. He has stood by his story, insisting she is still out there. This aligns with the theory that she was taken from the ship and absorbed into a dark world on land. Even though Amy was declared legally dead in 2010, the mission to find her remains active. The Federal Bureau of Investigation still offers a reward of $25,000 and recently updated her profile with age-progressed photos. They show a woman of 51 years with those same green eyes. As for the man known as Yellow, his path took a strange turn. He was recently located in a remote mountain community in Grenada, serving as a reverend in a humble shack of a church. He maintains his innocence, but the case continues to follow him even into his ministry. For Ron and Ivor Bradley, the search is a daily ritual. Ron still keeps Amy's car in the garage, maintaining it as if she might need it tomorrow. Every night, the parents share a quiet moment where they say 3 simple words, maybe tomorrow. They are not just waiting for an answer, they are waiting for a daughter. Thank you for spending this time with us at Cold Case Files. If you have any information regarding this case, please contact the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Don't forget to check out our other deep dives on the screen now. See you in the next mystery.